Hilchos Tumas Meis, Perek Chamisha Asar, the laws of corpse impurity, chapter 15. The entire chapter today deals with one question. What is the question? It goes like this. We learned a couple of days ago that when a corpse transfers impurity through oihel, tent, doesn't just mean being in the same room as it just means being under the same covering as it. As long as the covering meets the criteria of being 1 tefach by 1 tefach, and there's an airspace of a tefach in between the covering and the source of impurity, it spreads to everything under it. And typically, when an oihel serves as a good covering to spread the tumah, it also serves as a blocker to block the tumah from leaving it. Yesterday we saw that there's an exception to that. If a window opens in the covering or in a room, once a window opens in the room, now if that window meets the criteria, we saw yesterday there's 3 different types of windows, but we're going with the classic one, the window that's made for usage. I didn't have this yesterday, but I can show you this now. This is an ancient stone wall. You see how these windows used to look. The walls were very thick, and there was simply open spaces in the wall that served as windows. That's the kind of chaloinus that we're talking about in these chapters. So you have a window, and it's a window which is made for tashmish, for use. It's thick enough, you can put stuff in there, etc., use it as a storage place, as a nice windowsill. And when a window is made for tashmish, so the size, the minimum size that it has to be is 1 tefach by 1 tefach. As long as it's 1 handbreadth by 1 handbreadth in dimension, that becomes enough of an escape for the tumah trapped inside. If there's a corpse inside a home, inside a structure, and in the structure there's a window, a tefach by a tefach, the tumah is allowed to go through that window. The question that today's chapter deals with is there a way to seal up that escape? You have a structure, you have an oihel, and there's a chaloin, there's a window in that oihel, which is allowing the tumah to exit. Can you stop it from continuing to exit? Is there something you can put into that window that's going to make it considered no longer a window, sealed up, and now the tumah cannot go out? And the answer is going to be yes, you can stuff it up as long as 2 conditions are met. Number 1, the type of object that you're putting in there has to be one of those that if it would be a regular covering, it would be chaytzetz, it would block the tumah. Remember in chapter 13, we got a whole list of things. Certain things can spread tumah and can block it. Certain things can spread it, but not block it. Certain things can block it, but not spread it. Certain things can neither block nor spread. So if it's one of those elements that would typically serve to block the tumah, then it could be a good sealant to close up the window. That's condition A. Condition B, in addition to the object, or whatever it is that you're using to stuff up the window, having to be able to be chaytzetz, to be a block to tumah, it also has to meet the criteria, what's called ein daitoi lefanoisai. It's going to be there, and your mind is not to clear it away. You don't have any plans to ever move it away. It has no potential use that it could serve to you, which would cause you to want to take it away. Then, if those 2 criteria are met, then it's a good seal up for the window, and the ramifications would be that if now the window, because of this sealant, either becomes fully closed or becomes partially closed, so it's no longer a tefach by a tefach, now the tumah is not going to be allowed to go through. And the whole chapter today is that I'm giving us a list of varying different things that could serve as good sealers or not good sealers. It says that Rambam Halacha Aleph, Chaloin Tashmish, we're dealing with a window for use. It's the classic window whose size is 1 tefach by 1 tefach. Shestama kula, that a person sealed it completely. Oistama ad shenishar ba paches mitefach, or he sealed it partially, to the point that he left only a space less than a tefach by a tefach open. So does it work? Says the Rambam, im bedavar hachaytzetz bifnei hatuma sasam. Condition A, if he sealed it with something that typically serves to block tumah, harei ze chaytzetz, then it's a good blocker. And condition B, v'hu sheyiyah davar she'ein daitei lefanoisai. It has to also be an object where your plan is never to move it away. The Rambam seems to imply here that both conditions are required for both types of sealing, whether you seal up the entire window or you seal it only partially. The Rabbi later in this chapter comments, a general comment, that in a case where you're sealing the window completely, you only require the first condition. It only has to be a chaytzetz b'fnei hatuma. It doesn't have to be something which you don't plan to move away. A very big, wide-ranging argument between the Rambam and the Rabbi, in which the Rabbi says that everything we're going to learn in today's chapter only applies if you're doing a partial sealer. If you're doing a complete sealer, you only have to meet condition 1, not condition 2. At any rate, the Rambam says you have to meet both conditions in both cases. Lefichach, therefore, im sasam hachaloin. Let us assume that a person would seal the window, oy miatoy, or minimize the window's opening, be'oichlin she'enon muchsharin, using food that is not susceptible to become tamei. We mentioned the other day that food has to be detached from the ground and has to also come into contact with one of the 7 halachic liquids to be able to be susceptible to contract impurity. Once something is susceptible to contracting impurity, it cannot serve as a chaytzitz, it doesn't block tuma. But as long as it's not mukhshar, as long as it's not susceptible to becoming tamei, it does have the power of being chaytzitz. It has the power of blocking tuma. Nevertheless, says the Rambam, in this case, this would be a good example of only meeting condition 1, not condition 2. Einon chaytzitzin. These will not serve as blockers. Sha'af al pi she'ein mekablin tuma v'hareihin tahiri. And even though it's true that food in this state cannot become tamei, and therefore it remains always pure, and should serve as a good blocker, daite lefanoisan. Everybody knows that good quality produce, good quality apples, you're not planning to keep them in the window forever. You're going to take them to eat at one point in time. You're going to remove them. And therefore, they haven't met both conditions and not a good sealer. On the other hand, hoyu sruchin. What if we're dealing with rotten produce? Rotten produce that has not become susceptible to becoming tamei. Harei chaytzitzin, they will serve as a blocker. Some say that even if they became susceptible to becoming tamei, once they rot, they're no longer up for use, and therefore they meet both conditions of being chaytzitz and ein daita lefanoisa. V'chein teven saruach. Similarly, if you have rotten hay, not just not fit for human use, it's not even fit for animal use. And as we're going to see in the next halacha, it actually has thorns in it. And it's all disgusting. So it can't even be used for fuel. It can't even be used for making clay, like making bricks with it. It has nothing going for it. Chaytzitz. Then it does serve as a good blocker because you're not planning to remove it. You have no use for it. But if it's not rotten, then it's not going to be a good blocker, because it doesn't meet second condition. Your mind does plan to move it away. Tuvua shagadla, a similar case, if you have grain or a plant growing right outside your window, and the growth, the plant or the grain as it's growing from the ground came up and sealed the window, or at least minimized the window size. Says the Rambam, another example. It doesn't serve as a good blocker because you're going to clear it away. You don't want this plant to be a parasite to the wall and ruin the wall. So you're going to clear it. Since you're going to clear it, not a good blocker. But if the root of the plant was further away from the wall, it wasn't literally growing up on the wall, and then it bent over and kind of just peeked into the window, and that way, that's how it sealed the window. That does serve as a good blocker. And the same thing applies in all similar situations. Commentaries note, interesting thing. In the other chapter, we learned that zroim, regular edible plants, are not considered to be a good blocker for tumah. They don't even meet condition number 1. But the commentaries explain that's only with regard to being an oil, to being a covering. But with regard to being a blocker, that property they do have. Halacha beis. Let us consider the following case. Chavis shehimeleya greigreis sruchin. You have a clay barrel. These are the ancient clay barrels used to look. It's full of rotten, dried figs. So the figs are not edible. She'enon muchsharin. Additionally, they're not susceptible to becoming tamei. They haven't yet come into contact with liquid. The commentaries note this would be a little bit superfluous because once they're rotten, even if they have become susceptible to tumah, they will serve as a blocker, as I mentioned before in the last halacha. But the Rambam does seem to make a point to mention that they're also not mukhshar, which leads other commentaries to say that they have to actually not be susceptible. Once they become susceptible, even if they're rotten, it doesn't help. But the Rambam makes the point that they're both. Okay, they're both rotten and they're not susceptible, and therefore they're not fitting to be eaten. Umunachas bachaloin. And this barrel is sitting in the window. Now the question is, can it be a sealer? So you have to know like this. We're looking at this picture from inside the home. The mouth of the barrel is facing us, is facing inwards. If it were to be the opposite, if the bottom of the barrel was facing us and the mouth of the barrel was facing outwards, then there's no question that it would be a good blocker. Either because, as the commentaries say, this is a kli ha'osir lenachas, it's a utensil that's just meant to stay where it is, it's not meant to be moved. Or because when there's rotten figs in the barrel, the rotten figs also ruin the barrel's quality. And so it becomes in a state where you're not going to remove it. But the Rambam says, we're talking about a case, upiha chavis kalape hatuma, where the mouth of the barrel is facing inside towards where the source of impurity is. In which case, shahare hachavis tmeya, the barrel becomes impure. Why does the barrel become impure? Because clay, pottery utensils, only become impure when their airspace is exposed to the source of impurity. Had it been turned around, there wouldn't be any exposure. Now that it's this way, there's exposure to the impurity, the tumah is entering the airspace of the barrel is becoming impure. The question now is, do we look at the barrel, in which case it wouldn't be a good blocker, or do we look at the figs that are inside, which do serve as a good blocker? As we learned, rotten produce does serve as a blocker. V'chein, a similar question could be asked, kupa shi meleo teven saruach, if you have a box full of rotten hay, the rotten hay is so rotten, no animal can eat it. It cannot be used for making clay, because it's full of thorns. It can't be used for fuel, because it's moist. Umunachas b'chaloin, and it's in the window. Same question. Do we follow the box, which could contract impurity, and therefore doesn't serve as a blocker, or do we look at the hay? So the Rambam says, in we have to imagine and ask ourselves hypothetically, if we were to remove the barrel, or to remove the box, would the figs and the hay be able to stand on their own? Then they are a good blocker. But if not, they don't serve as a blocker. Because that means that they're not there independently. They're only there because of the utensil. And the utensil is not a good blocker. The Rambam continues, Asavim hamarim she'enon ru'uyin libehema. If you have bitter grasses, poisonous herbs, that are no good for even animals to consume, and therefore there's no reason why you would move it. Umatlaniyais she'ein bahen shalish al shalish, little cloths that do not have a size of 3 by 3 handbreadths. We're going to learn later in this book, that when it comes to cloth, once it's the size of 3 by 3, finger breadths, not handbreadths, 3 by 3 finger breadths, that is enough to make a piece of cloth susceptible to becoming impure. If it's less than that, it's not susceptible. So you're dealing with cloths that are less than 3 by 3 finger breadths, plus shahayu metunafim v'kashin, they were dirty and they were rough. Such a way that they're not even fit to be used to clean blood off of a wound, because they themselves will add to the wound. They're rough. They're going to scratch you. This is an example of something which you're not going to be moving away from this window. Or if you had a non-kosher animal, which has a limb or some flesh hanging off of its body into the window. Now, I made an inaccurate picture here because the Rambam says b'vehema tmeya has to be a non-kosher animal. Because a kosher animal, even if it has a limb that's hanging off into the window, you would take it and just slaughter it and eat it for yourself. But if it's a non-kosher animal, which you have nothing to do with, and now there's a part of this animal that's hanging into the window, it might be a good blocker because you're not going to remove it. Besides the fact that it's not kosher, it has to be a weak, scrawny animal where you won't even sell it to a non-Jew. It's also tied down, otherwise it can just run away. So a non-kosher animal, tied down, scrawny, and has a little limb hanging into the window. A non-kosher bird, which comes to rest in the window. And the Mishnah Lamelech adds it has to also be tied down, otherwise it can fly away. Plus the bird needs to be a bird that would scratch you. It's not even fitting to be used as a child's toy. Some birds, kids used to use as playthings. But not this one, because it's very, very, it's also rough. It's not going to be playful with you. If you have also a Gentile who is tied in chains and in the window, a type of a Gentile who is a prisoner of the king, and therefore nobody else can release him. No one will touch this guy. And an 8-month-old baby on Shabbat, which we learned that it's forbidden to move him. A pregnancy could either be full term, 9 months, or 7 months, and it's viable. The sages in their times, when it was an 8-month-old baby, it was considered to be non-viable. So you couldn't touch it if it was born in that scenario on Shabbos. So you have a baby, ends up in this window, 8 months old. Sounds outlandish, but you got to say all the cases that are potential, possible. Talmud discusses this. You have a baby now in the window. And let's say also you have some salt mixed with thorns, which therefore cannot be used for eating nor for tanning. And it's also on a pottery shard, so it's not damaging the wall. In other words, the Rambam is taking care of all possible back doors, all possible angles, how you might remove the salt. You might remove it to eat it, it's full of thorns. You might remove it to tan it with it, it's also full of thorns. You might remove it so to protect the wall, it's on a pottery shard. Kol elu mematin b'chaloin. All of these last things that we just mentioned, starting from the poisonous grasses, and the sackcloth, and the hanging limb, and the bird, and the baby, and the salt, all of these serve as minimizers of a window. Because A, they're good blockers, they're not susceptible to impurity. Nor is your mind planning to move them, because you cannot do any work with them. There's an interesting point that's made here in the commentaries about this baby. The baby, you're not planning to leave him there forever. All these other things could be left forever. The baby is it's a Shabbos. That's why it's muktzah. You're not going to move him. The second Shabbos is over, you're allowed to move him. So why is this considered not daite lefanoisai? So from here the commentaries prove that as long as you're not planning to move it for a day, for a full day, that's already considered enough to meet condition number 2 of ein daite lefanoisai. It's a revolutionary novelty in the Rambam, and we're going to see another ramification of this momentarily. Continues the Rambam, Mechein Sefer Torah Shabbalah. You have a worn-out Torah scroll in the window. As the Rambam classifies this later in this book, a worn-out Torah scroll means it's been literally worn out. The letters have been erased. There aren't even 85 letters in a row. That's how worn out this is. And remember, this is those days when everybody had Torah scrolls. It wasn't like today, Torah scrolls are reserved to be in the Holy Ark and that's it. This is how they learned. So this was very common to have these scrolls of Torah, and they just got worn out with use. So you have a scroll sitting in the window. If you decided that's where you're going to bury it, since you're not planning to take it away, it serves as a good minimizer of a sealer for a window. But snow and hail, kfir is frost, and glid is ice and water. All of these things, if they ended up accumulating in the window, they do not serve to minimize the window. And the Rambam gives a very curious reason. He says, because they don't meet condition number 1. Because they're susceptible to impurity. The obvious thing you might say, and actually we said it the other day when it came to snow and all this stuff, is that snow and all this stuff is going to melt. It's not an oyal hamiskayim, it won't last. Why does the Rambam choose this less obvious reason? So the Sridei Eish, Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg, says, he answers this question based on what I told you before. The snow and the frost and the ice, they could stay for a day. And once something could stay for a day, it qualifies as ein daite lefanoisai. You're not going to remove it. Therefore, you have to come on to another reason. The Rambam gives the other reason of not meeting condition number 1. But as far as condition number 2 is concerned, they very much do meet the criteria because they may very well last for a day. Halacha Gimel, mi et tefach. Let's say you decided to minimize the size of the tefach of the window, but paches mikazayis mibsar hameis, with an entity of a corpse. But it's an entity that's too small to transmit impurity. It's a fascinating concept. How much of a corpse is required to give impurity? A kazayas, an olive-sized portion. Here you have a piece of corpse, literally a piece of impurity, but it's too small. It's less than a kazayas, and now it's minimizing the size of the window. Or bepachas mikazayas mibsar nevela, less than an olive-sized portion of animal carcass. Also, usually communicates impurity at the size of an olive-sized portion. You have less now. Or a bone that's less than the size of a barley corn from a dead body. Again, not big enough to transmit impurity. Or less than a lentil size of dead rodent, which we're going to see also communicates impurity at the size of a lentil. Fascinatingly, you have these things that are too small to transmit impurity. They could serve as a blocker. Because all these entities are actually pure. You don't care about them. Therefore, they're considered as if you're not going to move them away. Same thing if you have less than an egg size of food that has not become yet susceptible to becoming impure. They're less than an egg size. They're not important to you. They're not significant. You're not going to move them away. And therefore, they do serve to minimize the tefach size of a window. So a fascinating thing. You have an entity which usually is part of something impure, working against the impurity and helping to make it pure. There are exceptions. We're going to see in a moment in halacha hey. But in the meantime, says the Rambam halacha dalit sasam hachaloin bikli cheres v'hayapiv lachutz. Here the Rambam comes to what I mentioned before. You have a clay pottery utensil sealing the window. Its mouth is facing outside. It does serve as a blocker because it doesn't become impure from its back, only from its ear space. So it's pure. Now, obviously, you have to also meet condition number 2. This utensil must be disgusting, loathsome. It has to be full of holes. So it cannot even be used in the process of bloodletting. So you don't have second condition where you're not planning to move it away. Halacha hey, let's return to the case where you had an element of corpse flesh, but it was too small. Let's say hoya babayis meis. Let's say inside the home there was a full corpse, or a quarter of a kav of bones, or other scenarios of bones that would usually transmit impurity in a tent, like a full spine, a full skull. And then you go to the window and you put a piece of bone that's less than a barley corn. On its own, it would not transmit impurity, but there are other bones in the home. Now this bone, which a second ago was a good sealer, now it's not a good sealer. Because we combine the bones. We say the bone in the window connects to the bones in the home, and together they're all an entity of impurity, and therefore they don't work. Same thing if you have a corpse or an olive-sized portion of a corpse flesh, and you put in the window less than an olive-sized portion of corpse flesh, it's not a good minimizer. Because the meat and the flesh, the two pieces of flesh, combine. But you don't combine on cross entities. Bones go with bones, flesh goes with flesh. But a bone less than the size of a barley corn could serve as a minimizer for a window if the issue in the home is corpse flesh. And less than an olive-sized portion of corpse flesh could minimize a window which is being affected by bones. Anything like that. Let's say you minimized the window space by using some threads, warp and woof threads that had saras. Later on in this book, we're going to have a whole section of laws on saras. One of the ways saras affects impurity is through clothing. It appears in red or green on clothing, and in many of those cases, the clothing becomes impure. So you're using this impure piece of clothing in the window. Or a clod of earth from a beis hapras, a field in which you have plowed a grave. Not a good minimizer. Because again, these things are impure. They don't serve as a blocker. What if you took the dirt from the beis hapras and you made it into a brick? Now it's pure, and now it minimizes. As we saw in chapter 10, the rabbis only decreed on the clod of earth in its natural state. Once you've changed it from its natural state, no longer is it impure. What if the window area was sealed or partially minimized by a spider web? If it was thick, it had substance, that's a good blocker. But it doesn't have substance, not so thick, it does not serve as a blocker.